Black History Month film discussion. We're going to be discussing the film Toni Morrison, The Pieces I Am. I thank you so much for joining. If you didn't get a chance to watch the film, that's okay. I still thank you for being here. We try to keep these film discussions both focused enough and broad enough so that if you watched it, you're going to get a lot out of it. And if you didn't, there's still going to be themes for us all to discuss. I encourage you all to participate today, so it's not just my voice and my baby's voice in the background that we're hearing as we chat. And one thing I would just love to share that we try to always start our diversity events by is that we're really all here to be learning together, and that it's okay to be showing up with beginner's mind. We encourage showing up with beginner's mind. We're all at various points of our journey of exploring diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and that this is a place where we encourage everyone to be vulnerable and brave, and that at the same time always being respectful and mindful. So we 100% encourage you to be brave and vulnerable, and we don't tolerate any kind of hate or disrespect. So just starting off with that, I'm gonna start by sharing the trailer for the film, and then we will go from there. So just give me one moment to share that.
My grandfather bragged all the time that he had read the Bible, and it was illegal in his life to read. Ultimately, I knew that words have power.
I wanted as many people who could hear my voice to understand the importance of her work. Get people to trust that, oh, this is something safe, and then, bam, hit them with Toni Morrison.
One of the early reviews says she's got a great talent. One day she won't limit it to only writing about Black people. Like, really, it's limiting for her to write about Black people?
People began to buy Toni Morrison, and then we began to teach her, and as a consequence, they had to pay attention.
I know you're sick unto death of being labeled a black writer.
I prefer it.
Oh, I thought you probably were tired of it.
Well, I'm tired of people asking the question.
Oh yes, of course.
I don't know where this woman's energy came from to raise two kids, to bring other people of color to the party, and also write these novels.
Toni was an editor at Random House.
Navigating a white male world was not threatening. It wasn't even interesting. I was more interesting than they were. And I wasn't afraid to show it.
Suddenly, the canon wasn't the private property of white male writers.
I've thrown this book across the room and then walked down the steps laughing. Like, you read Toni and you cry, but you gotta laugh.
Texas Bureau of Corrections banned Paradise because it might incite a riot. And I thought, how powerful is that?
When Toni Morrison published Beloved, it was an extraordinary turning point. We can never think about slavery in the same way.
A friend of mine called me up early in the morning and said, Toni, you won the Nobel Prize. And I remember holding the phone thinking, she must be drunk.
Toni Morrison's work shows us through pain all the myriad ways we can come to love. That is what she does, with some words on a page.
Okay. I feel like the 2-minute trailer. There's like enough. There's so much just in that 2 minutes to talk about. But I wanted to start just by I'm just super curious how many people here, and you can just raise your hand or you can speak out, unmute yourself, however you want to do it, have read something by Toni Morrison before, whether that was recently or a long time ago, or maybe you're unfamiliar. So just give a little hand raise if you have read something. I'm gonna raise my. We can see those hands going up. Great. So it looks like about 5, maybe a couple more people. I see 5 hands raised. Great. I was just super curious. So we can kind of start there. You can put your hands down. If before we kind of dive into the documentary, if anybody kind of wants to share a little bit about how they came to be familiar with Toni Morrison's work at any point in their lives, I can just share without going too deeply yet, but I was first introduced to Toni Morrison in college and in a college English lit class, and she had a huge impact on me. So it was really great to revisit her work in this way. So I'm just curious if anybody wants to share a little bit about, their familiarity with Toni Morrison work prior to this film or outside of this film. Go ahead, Josh.
So they're taking down a tree in front of my house. So if you hear like loud bangs and stuff, that's what it is. I read Beloved. I was an English major in college, and I read Beloved in an African American lit class that was really kind of profoundly transformative for me. It's some of my favorite books ever I read in that class. And Beloved is just a book that I think anyone who reads it, it really sticks with you. I mean, I don't know if cringe is the right word. It's just very emotionally jarring even to think about now, and I think it's just it's a really profound piece of work.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, they so I kind of watched the documentary in little bits of time over the past week or so, and finished it up the other day, and finally got to the part in the documentary about Beloved, because they do talk about that book, and it's one of the books. I read The Bluest Eye first, I think, and then I read Beloved. And the themes in it, one thing that I think is really, like, one of the things that stayed with me about the film is they said, one of the people that they were interviewing said, Toni Morrison's work tells the story beneath the story. And they were talking about Beloved in that context. But what they're kind of referring to is Beloved is a story about a slave who escapes and then is caught and takes the life of her children, so that makes that choice versus sending them back into slavery. And so that's kind of where it begins. And the story beneath the story, and what so many people have said about her work, is that it tells the story of slavery, but in this way of complexity and beauty and choice and all these other things that is really the story beneath the story of the way that we're kind of, well, very different than how we're taught American history, right? But even in more like progressive histories, where it's still taught, like she still tells the story that goes so deeply beneath the story. So does anybody else want to share? I saw in the chat, Marielle. Marielle says she read The Bluest Eye, yes, in high school. Does anybody else have anything to share about how they were kind of first introduced? Great. So one of the other things I kind of wanted to start with is if you did get a chance to view the film, I'm just curious kind of what stood out to you, what inspired you, what stayed with you from watching the film. And then I'll share a little bit about my impressions as well. Go ahead, Josh. Thank you.
I don't want to be the only one who talks here, but I think probably the thing that stood out to me the most was just how she was a person who was really uncaring about societal standards, and she just sort of forged her own path. Just like with I just think she was just so groundbreaking on just about every level. I mean, she had like a really sort of calculated apathy towards what her role should be and what she should be doing, and she just sort of blazed her own path in that way. And I thought that was really striking. Especially like when they start, because the last part of it, a lot of it is devoted to Beloved, and just sort of like even like that book was just groundbreaking in terms of the perspective it was providing for slavery and things like that. But just throughout her life, I mean, she always just really didn't seem to care what she was supposed to be doing. She just sort of knew where she wanted to go, and she went there.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that stood out to me so much was and I felt so grateful when I was watching it because even though I'm so familiar with her work, I've never had like watched anything that was such an intimate like sit down with her, and I was just so inspired by her being, like the way she shows up, the way she speaks about her writing, and the way that the inspiration comes to her. And so that I think like her essence almost is what's as my takeaway from the film, as much like even already being familiar with her work, it was just her, like that. I feel so grateful to have that experience of getting to know her a little bit better. Anybody else want to share their takeaways?
I like the part of the documentary where she mentioned she was when she was teaching at Princeton, I believe it was, creative writing, and how she told the students, don't write what you know. Write about the Mexican girl in Texas or in Houston, she said, working at the restaurant. I just thought that was so profound. I mean, that's exactly what we're, get outside your comfort zone, and that's where the growth is. So I really liked how she talked about that experience.
Yeah, I loved that too. I loved learning about her as a teacher. That was something too that I wasn't as familiar with, and I thought just gave really, really interesting perspective on her and her life and her work, and yeah, her passions and beliefs and values. One thing that I thought was really interesting towards the beginning of the documentary, she talked about her writing of not writing having just Black characters, but actually being from the Black perspective, and without the white gaze. And that's something I think I remember learning about in college, but I've heard that term come up more and more. What's the matters? Say hi. Okay. Recently. So I thought that was like so interesting to hear it spoken about, and so groundbreaking of her work in that way, to kind of just like she said, like have her experience and what she knows or what she was writing about just be enough, right? Like she didn't have to make it for everyone, and in turn it became for everyone, right? Because we got to learn so much from her writing.
So I didn't get to watch much of the film because I just found out about it yesterday, but maybe like an hour or something I watched. But what I did admire about her was her attitude about things. And she wasn't afraid, and especially in that time period, as a Black woman, especially, for her to demand the things that she demanded and be unapologetic for who she was admirable.
Yeah, Nicole, what you just said about her being unafraid, actually towards the end, when you get to finish it, she speaks about a certain character in, I think it was Song of Solomon, um and that it was based on, or had like the feeling of so many women in her life who just were, she described them as being like almost blessed and fearless. And the way she's, and that's how she kind of so came across in this documentary as well. And I had this thought of like, oh gosh, like that's how I want to, you know, not fearless in a sense of like it's not okay to be afraid of things, but that it doesn't stop you from speaking out or from going after your dreams or for writing about the things that you know you need to write about. And the way she spoke of these women and the way she came through, I was like, oh, that's how I want my daughter and my son to see me, like it was just like really inspiring. So that kind of feeling comes back around at the end, Nicole. So yeah.
Well, what was interesting, I thought, now she was from, I believe, Ohio, correct? And then she said she grew up with people of all walks of life. So I was kind of curious, and I don't know if this comes out into the end, like where did she develop this kind of attitude in terms of her Black empowerment and voice,
Yeah.
considering that she did say she grew up in an area that was so well diverse. So
It's so
curious to
interesting.
know.
It does come back through in a couple points that come to mind. One, she speaks about her father and her mother, and her father witnessed a lynching of two Black businessmen when he was young, and he did not trust white people. He wouldn't let them in the house. Like so even though they were growing up in this really kind of integrated area, he carried, his trauma and his upbringing with him. And then his mother, though, or her mother, she said, kind of got to know and judged each person on an individual basis. So she had these like two different influences in her life in that way. And then when she went to work, she talks about, I'm going to forget which college it was, that she first started teaching at, but when she went to work to teach, all of a sudden things were so segregated, and she said she would steal colored only signs and send them back to her mom because she couldn't believe.
That's what it was. That's where I kind of
Yeah.
ended it. Yeah.
Yeah, she
Okay.
couldn't believe. She's like, can you believe this? Like, because of the neighborhood that they grew up in,
Right.
she just was like, couldn't believe it. So there, I think there's so much both from her upbringing, her family, and then, going kind of out into the world and seeing even more than where she grew up in her neighborhood. Yes, Amanda.
I appreciate this. I didn't get to see the documentary, but and I hadn't really thought about Toni Morrison in a long, long time. But I watched the trailer a couple of times, and I don't know if we all have these sort of memories in the back of our minds when and one of the memories I had was that in the idea of a white filter, I can remember thinking that I was pretty progressive, did a lot of stuff in the 60s and 70s around civil rights, but thought I was pretty progressive, but and it also, I mean, in some of the sort of assumptions that I made around people of color, people with disabilities, were shaken by her. That whole interview with Dick Cavett was when she put Cavett in his place about she wasn't tired of being called a Black author. She was tired of the question, and that just flips the whole thing around. And she was able to do that in a lot of sort of areas, and she did it with an authenticity that it wasn't just put on, it was just her being, and you believed that, and you believed that was a perspective that being a white guy, really in that white filter, had never really thought about, 20 years ago, 25 years ago when I saw some of this stuff. So it reminded me of sort of those feelings that I had back then when I went, whoa, that's certainly I'm not coming from a perspective that wasn't really on the right track here. So yeah, so this was really fun to sort of remember and bring back memories of this. And and remember what a force of nature she is.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful thing to kind of have these moments and memories of when your perspective was so shifted or changed, or your eyes were so open. And it's interesting that you have that memory of her, because that's how I remember when I first started reading her work in college. Like, similarly, I was raised very progressively and to be inclusive and to, I mean, you want to say hi to everybody? And to really try to see people's perspective, and the quote, like, walk a mile in their shoes, things like that, right? And then read her books, and I remember thinking, oh, I can't, right? Like, I can do everything that I can to try to understand and empathize, but because of the color skin I was ever born with, like, I will never have the experience of the little girl in the bluest eye. But it is my job to read these stories, right? And to be exposed to it, and to try um to keep exposing myself to these things. And I remember that shift for me in Toni Morrison. It just kind of like blew my whole world open.
Now, I know, Janelle, you say that your exposure progressive and things like that, and that's probably obviously because of your dad and the work that he's done growing up. But how important do you think it would have been? Because I know, like you, Josh, and I think somebody else said they read her literature in college. First of all, was that offered to you in high school? And then if it was or wasn't, how important do you think it would have been for other students? Because I'm going to assume that you went to a predominantly white school, correct? So how important do you think that type of literature would have been to the other students in your school if it was offered or it wasn't? I'm not sure. So I'm just asking.
That's a great question. I did, I had a, yeah, so in my town was predominantly white, and then I did have a couple years at a private school that was more diverse, and then went back to my regional school in West Hampton. So some of you are located in that area. And I never came across her work until college. And interestingly as well, it was at the same time I started going to college in Cambridge in Boston. And so I was in a much more diverse city at the same time being exposed to her work. So it was like my perspectives being introduced to her work through her literature and the world around me were both expanding at the same time. So I think that that's really, really interesting. I think it would be so important to be, Marielle said she was interested in, introduced in high school. I'd love to hear you share, Marielle, if you're comfortable, about that experience for you, reading her younger. But I think it would have been so important. And one of the reasons I really wanted to do her work this month is because of the book bannings going on across the country. And she is on every banned book list there is. So I just wanted to kind of lift that up as well. So that's a great question, Nicole. Any other thoughts on that? If people either were exposed to her work earlier, or if they were not, and how that would have shaped things for them?
I I think that I mean I grew up in a very small, predominantly white also neighborhood in school, and I think but my household was mixed race. So I think that being exposed to that kind of literature at a younger age for a lot of I mean myself and even a bunch of my peers would have been highly beneficial because we weren't otherwise exposed to any of that. We got the basic Black History Month stuff, but growing up with somebody who is not of the same race as mine, you kind of see the other side of it. Again, you can't walk a mile in their shoes, but um, it definitely would have been beneficial at a younger age.
Just to go back to Nicole's question, I grew up actually in a city, and I went to school in an inner city, and it was the high school was very integrated. It was a long time ago. It was well before Toni Morrison, but even in a very integrated inner city high school, there was very little effort on and this was a sort of a college preparatory high school, very little effort on through the curriculum to really get at any sort of history or any Black writers or Black culture or whatever. Looking back on that, and I went to Northeastern for college, and was, although I was very exposed to the people of color in high school, it was just way different. I mean, there was an African American studies. There was opportunities to learn way more. I mean, just in that 1 year, the difference between high school and college was extraordinarily different, although both from inner city.
I think it's interesting to think about too, you know, as a parent and as somebody that was formerly a student, you know, the reasons that they point to banning these books, you know, as we talked about, like in Beloved, that like the main theme of that story, it is violent and it's hard to read and it's hard to understand, but the what you can learn from it with that is so it's so worth it, right? Like it's so worth those hard parts, I think. And that, yeah, I wouldn't like trade that. Like even though it was so hard to read, it's hard to think about those hard things. I wouldn't trade that for never having that. George, go right ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you so much. So actually I didn't read or I didn't watch the film. I'm so sorry because we're being so busy. But just reading a little bit about Toni a few minutes ago, I think that she was a great writer. And as a person from a different cultural background, because I grew up in Africa as an adult and migrated to the United States as a full adult. So it was different, especially listening, reading, and listening to what occurred in the United States back in Africa, maybe before you migrated. Your family friends will tell you, oh, you have to be so careful because what's occurring in the United States, especially white people, Black people, this kind of stories like that. But for me, I was so happy and fortunate that uh, after I came through, my first line of work was working with young people in Job Corps. And I would say that's one of the best jobs I ever had, to work directly with young people, because they will show you exactly what culture is between 16 and 24. And that was a very diverse environment where you have white kids, Black kids, and everyone in the same environment, and they will speak to you about culture. So I'm so thankful that I got those experiences from young people. Other than that, I don't think I would have been so successful working in a diverse environment. So just reading all these stories right now and listening to these stories is tough, but I think that, those are things that we can learn from, we can work from, and we can all strengthen our own cultural environment, our own families, and that we can give them the best stories to make life better for everyone else.
Thank you so much, George. So well said. I'm curious too, even if, you know, you weren't familiar with Toni Morrison, and even if you didn't get a chance to watch the documentary, like, are there, I'm a bit of a bookworm over here, so I'm curious if there's other literature that has kind of changed you, moved you, shaken your perspective in that way that kind of comes to mind as we're talking about this, like outside of Toni Morrison, just like literally any books, anything like that, that's really shifted the way you see the world.
Just throw this one out here. The biography of Malcolm X was a powerful and transformative book for me.
Anyone else? You can drop them in the chat too. Now I'm like just super curious, and so up to know.
White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo was a big one for me.
Invisible Man was a great book.
Thank you. If you think of your life-changing books, like I said, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I think another thing that I kind of, as I quite literally juggle motherhood at the same time of having this important conversation that means so much to me, I was so inspired by the way that Toni, like she said, she woke up at like 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. every morning to write. And that she wrote her, you know, she wrote her novels while also being this hands-on mother and this teacher, and just the way that she approached her life. I think we already kind of touched on that, like fearlessness that she had, but I think also just the way that she seemed to really believe in herself. And I was just very, very inspired by that, in the way that she kind of took that time for herself to write, and felt that her writing was so important that she really needed to kind of put it out there. And I thought it was so cool too that there's one point where, when she was about to begin writing Beloved, she like literally had a vision. She was looking out at the water in front of her, and she had a vision of this little girl come out of the water, like fully dressed. She didn't even call it a vision. She said she saw it, and in her hat and everything. And so, as somebody who loves to write and read, I loved the like inside look at how her characters came to her and how the stories came to her. Because they also talked about in Beloved that it was a very small news article that she read that inspired Beloved, and she didn't do any further research into it. She wanted to write her own story of it, but that it was like a very short news article that she read about this woman who had taken the lives of her children when she got caught escaping from slavery. And the article read that the article was saying the choice was whether to be trying this woman for murder or for destruction. This is so terrible, but for destruction of property. And if they tried her for murder, then it was recognizing that her children were human lives, right? And so they were weighing whether to try her for destruction of property because they were slaves. And so she just read this article and birthed an entire world-changing novel from it. And so that kind of goes back to that theme of that story beneath the story that we talked about, right? Like, she is able to take these bits of history and paint us these pictures that are so humanizing, that are so thought-provoking, in just a really, really powerful way. So I really appreciated the way that they showed her process, her creative process. I think that was something that was really interesting and intriguing to me. I'm gonna just kind of open it up a little bit, and I would love just kind of any thoughts that have been stirred for you in this conversation. It's okay if you didn't watch the documentary. It's okay if you haven't read her work. And or if this conversation has kind of inspired you to look into something a little bit further, I would love to hear that as well. So kind of any thoughts that are coming up for you now before we close. I think one thing that I'm kind of taking away is that I often, or lately, I think in my life have wanted to read, like I veer towards nonfiction if I want to learn something and I want to kind of like expand my perspective. And this reminded me that most of the books in my life up until a certain point that really changed my perspective were fiction and were novels, like, Toni Morrison's novels. And so it's just kind of inspiring me to either read more Toni Morrison or just kind of find those really, really juicy fiction books that can have that same power through storytelling and through characters and through just really helping us see people in a different light. So it's my takeaway.
You know what I was thinking too? I feel like a lot of times we focus on the past so much. So I'd like to see more modern day Black issues be talked about, because I think it shifts over time. It has shifted over time as well. So I know like an author that I really like is a woman who goes by the name of Sister Soldier, and she has some really great books. She tells more of like a urban story and less of like a historical story.
I'll have to check her out, Nicole. Anybody else have kind of closing thoughts before we end today?
That's great. This is George. I just want to say thank you so much for the forum, man. It's great, it's great to get exchange of ideas, learn new things, because life has changed and life will continue to change. Life will never be the same. And that's one thing I always know. Life has changed, life will continue to change, and life will always change. And I always know that there will always be good people and there will always be bad people. Like what Toni said, when she was 2 years old, her landlord, because they couldn't pay her rent, could you imagine he's going to burn his property because people won't pay the rent? So I won't consider him to be a bad white man. I'll consider him to be just a fool. So I'm not just going to say, he was a bad white man, but he was a fool. Perhaps he had mental health issues that we work with today, and perhaps we didn't even know, because no wise person or rational person will burn their property because someone don't pay a rent. So just looking back, perhaps at that time, people had a lot of issues that affected them that maybe today will help them. We don't know, because no wise man will do that.
Thanks, George. Yeah, I think what that just made me think of too is that I just so appreciate how Toni not only shared the stories that she shared in her books, but she's really been open about her own story. And she was so open about her own story in this documentary. And I just really appreciated that as well. Well, thank you, everybody. If you didn't get a chance to watch the documentary, it's really, really good. Toni is they kind of went into it at the end, but she's a Nobel Prize winner. So she's just a really important person in our modern day, and then she dives into the history as well. So I encourage you to watch it, or read a little bit about her, or just kind of take any threads that we talked about today and let them inspire you throughout your week. And I'd love to kind of hear more about anything that comes to you after this. So feel free to shoot an email or be in touch. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.